universities, but there's so many good speakers here. This is just a great conference. Um, I'm going to talk to you today about school employee sexual misconduct. And um, just a little background, about 10% of all students in studies reported that studied kids in grades 8 through 11 and retrospectively asked them if they'd ever experienced any kinds of these particular behaviors directed toward them by an adult, by someone in a school, reported that they had experienced sexual misconduct by an adult in the school. The way the questions were phrased, because the study was done by the American Association of University Women, and it was really about peer sexual abuse, they hadn't really thought much about adults, although that was one of the options that they could respond to. It was phrased as unwanted. So it's probably even more than 10% of students who've been the target. The number of students subject to school employee sexual misconduct, if we take those percentages and turn them into numbers, it's 5.5 million. And in Colorado, 88,000 sort of at any one time. So those are important numbers to think about. Sometimes people say to me, actually shockingly a lot, well, it's only 10% of kids. I mean, that's not really a big problem, is it? And my answer is yes, it's a huge problem. And it's a huge problem if it's 1% of kids. People send their children to school because it's the law and because they trust that schools will look out for their kids. And we want to make sure that happens. And I know you do too, because that's why you're here today. So I'm just going to briefly go through a little bit of the sort of the foundational information and then try to really get into prevention. What do we know from the studies that we've done and from the work we've done? So there's no national data available on how many staff members abuse children. We don't keep those records. None of the crime data that's available keeps them. It's not done in any way that would let us know. What we do know that there has been increased attention to this issue, and there are more licenses of teachers and professional people being revoked than ever before. So there are cases coming forward. People are being removed from schools. We also know that those who cross those boundaries include teachers and coaches, custodians, bus drivers, everybody, resource officers, counselors, aides, substitutes, any adult in school, including volunteers and contractors who come in to do work. About 70% of the allegations and convictions identify male abusers, about 30% identify female abusers. The offenders by job title, the largest proportion comes in a teacher role. Full-time teachers, substitutes, aides, but it's a teacher role. The coach is the second most, and very often that coach is also a teacher, but the abuse was occurring in the coach role, not necessarily in the teacher role, although that blurs because sometimes the access comes in the teacher role, moves into the coach role. It's not really clear cut. Bus drivers, other kinds of school employees like school superintendents, for instance, security guards, resource officers. It's a range. It's everybody. The targets, and I call them targets, they're also victims. I use that language back and forth because I use the word target because I want to be clear that these kids are targeted. They're focused on, they're pursued. They're more likely to be female. They're disproportionately African descent or Latino. Students with disabilities are overrepresented based upon their proportion in the school population. And they're vulnerable kids. And by vulnerable kids, I mean kids who may not have a good self-image, kids who may come from a family where there's drug or alcohol abuse or abuse in the family. Kids who are loners, kids who don't feel like they fit in. I mean, all kids really are vulnerable, as you know, but those who are targeting students tend to be able to identify those who are most vulnerable and most amenable or to the kind of abuse and attention that may come along. So the patterns really look at the person has to have access to the kids. They have to be able to get to them and respond to them. They have to have some kind of privacy of some sort, and then they have to be able to control. So those three things need to come together by and large to make this happen. And so the prevention looks at how to look at access, how to look at privacy, and how to look at control. So a lot of the majority of the actual physical abuse occurs off-site of a school, but the grooming, the connections, the preparation for it happens from the school. So that's where it begins. That's where the connections get made. That's where things are going on. You'll see that some of it, if you look down this list, you can see that there's electronic communication that happens both in school and out of school. So very often a school employee is texting a student, sending photographs to students, asking for photographs, doing those kinds of things while in the school building and sometimes outside the school building. Classroom, a small percentage actually happens in the classroom, although again, a lot of the grooming happens in the classroom. Talking to the kids, offering them presents, the whole mechanism of getting the kid to trust. Bathrooms, closed places, locker rooms, outside recreation areas, playgrounds, pools, dorms, stairwells. It happens all sorts of places around the school. This data is based upon national studies reporting where there have been reports and people have been arrested for the sexual abuse based upon those studies. So there's some patterns and some myths that go on. Whoops. I just messed up. I'll do this a lot. I just want to warn you. I was trying to get some little pop-up that came up off of the screen and I just popped backwards. So hang on 1 second. I'm going to say that there's some, I'm just going to talk about the slide because if I try to go back, I just promise you, it'll just be a mess, just a whole mess. I can see there may be a few of you who can identify, but probably most of you are much better at this than I am. So there's some myths and patterns that I want to talk to you about. One of the patterns is that, at least for elementary students and often in middle and high school, very often the person who has targeted kids for sexual misconduct and abuse is a very popular member of the staff, usually a teacher and sometimes a coach. And so this is someone that people trust, they like, kids like this person, others like this person. And for most of the kids, this person is safe. This person may have done good things for kids. This person may have been helpful to parents. This person may be a good colleague. But of course, that's also a way that the person stays safe from being found out because they're well liked. They've gotten people to trust them. So that's not unusual. There's a disproportionate number of abusers who are convicted and go to prison who were outstanding teacher of the year at the state, local, and national levels. One of the patterns is kind of romantic situational. So a lot of the middle and high school patterns are that an adult targets a student, tells the student that, you're really special, you're not like all the other kids. Very often when it's a male targeting a female student, will say things like, my wife doesn't understand me, my marriage is on the rocks, I don't have anybody to confide in, you're the kind of girl that would that seems to be mature, those kinds of things. And so it takes on a pattern almost like a boyfriend girlfriend wooing. And for students, very often it's very confusing. The person might be a popular teacher, might be very attractive, and the student isn't really clear what's happening and what's going on. And remember that the when a predator is targeting a student, they're trying to get the student to like them. So they're doing all the kinds of things that make a student feel good. They give them presents, they write them notes, they send them little texts about how special you are, they give them special privileges in class. Very often they give them food, they have lunches for them, they have snacks for them. There's all sorts of things that are done. They often buy them telephones as a secret telephone so their parents won't be able to see what's going on between them. So those are kind of a bit of the patterns. It's a grooming relationship, which I'll talk about in a second. There's a couple of myths that I just want to put to the side. One is that there's a lot of false reports. There's no evidence that this is the case. And in fact, when there are false reports, generally they're easy to find out. So in a false report, someone might say the teacher did this to me, and someone might ask, well, when did it happen? What was the room like? What was the teacher wearing? And usually the student says no, sort of breaks down and says, no, I made this up. So I just want to put that to the side, that's not very common. Another myth is that all of the abusers are serial abusers. They have hundreds of victims. Some of them do. That's accurate, but not all of them do. Sometimes it's just one kid or two kids. I don't mean that in that way, but they're just different patterns. Sometimes a lot of victims, sometimes a few, sometimes early in their career and not later, sometimes later in their career and not earlier. And the other myth is that most of the people who sexually target kids in schools were sexually abused themselves. And that also is not accurate. And that's often something that's used by the predator to try to get sympathy, and as a way to not have to face consequences. But that there just isn't a direct relationship there. If there were a direct relationship there, I might point out, since so many women are sexually abused, there would be a much higher proportion of sexual abusers who were women than there really are. That is not to say that having been sexually abused as a child doesn't have long-term effects on whoever, but that's not that doesn't really explain why people sexually abuse. We know that people sexually abuse kids in schools, some of them because it's the way they get their primary way of having sexual pleasure and sexual focus. Those kinds of abusers, who people call pedophiles or fixated abusers, tend to be at the elementary school level more than at other levels. Others are just people who take advantage of situations, who exploit people, who use people, and whose worldview is really to just fulfill their own needs without any care for the needs of children and the needs of others. So let me talk about grooming. Grooming, as you know, because you're all pretty up on this, and I'm probably not telling you one single new thing at all so far. Grooming are those behaviors that predators use to get targets to trust them. And that's really the focus of grooming. And so special favors, help with school, positive connections, just a whole lot of things. So connections to parents and guardians, trips, presents. For instance, sometime a typical case that I've looked at is an elementary teacher who calls up a mom. The mom's a single parent, and and there's no male in the household. And the teacher, who's a male, says to the mom, you know, your son is extraordinary. He's not doing very well in school, but it's not because he doesn't have the ability. He just needs a little bit of extra help. You know, and I'm wondering, what do you think about me giving him some extra tutoring or a little bit? Because I really think he has a lot of potential. And the mom, who has been worrying that her son doesn't have this positive role model of a man in the house, is thinking, my gosh, the most popular teacher who everybody wants their kids to have is going to help my son. That's fantastic. And of course, the mom says, yes, yes, that's great. And what happens is there's tutoring, and then pretty soon, gee, I wonder if you'd like me to take your son to a ball game I happen to be going, or I have some tickets to this, or um, I have a cabin and I go camping and fishing, and would you like me to take your son along? And so one thing leads to another. And of course, as you know from the story I'm telling you, the teacher is sexually abusing the child. The mom doesn't really realize that. The child actually loves this person who's been so kind and good to him, but also does not want to be sexually abused. And it's very confusing. The child doesn't even know how to think about it. On the one hand, he gets attention and help and good times and fun. On the other hand, he's having to do things and experience things that are very, very traumatic.
If we go anywhere else, we need a.
And so that's kind of an example of how parents are groomed as well as kids. Also, other teachers, you know, hey, you need to leave early tonight? Don't worry, I'll take care of your bus duty. Hey, you need a hand? No, don't worry, I'm happy to help. So in order to be successful, the predator really has to groom the target, the child, but the predator also has to groom colleagues, uh, the principal, other people who supervise him or her, and the parents. So that's kind of the way that grooming works. So I just, of course, just told you what I just have in this slide. That's another downside of my talks. I forget what's next. Uh, so. So in terms of allegations, most sexual misconduct goes unreported in schools. Kids think they're telling or they're giving hints, but people don't pick up on the hints. Even when it's reported, it's often ignored because generally a student doesn't come up and say to the principal, I need to tell you that this teacher is doing this, that, and the other thing to me. They say things like, the guy's weird, I don't like how he behaves, it's creepy. You know, so there's lots of ways that the language that kids use that adults don't pick up on. It's also the case that kids' friends use that language too, and people don't pick up on it. Very seldom does the report come directly from a child. It might come from the child's friend's parent, for instance. So a friend says to their mom, you know, Ms. So-and-so is really weird around, you know, Andrew. She kind of touches him a lot and stuff. I just think it's just really weird and it's creepy. And I don't know what's going on, but it doesn't seem right to me. And then that mom calls the school and says, I think you need to look into this. Or sometimes the child will tell their parent and then their parent calls. But it's usually informal, and that's important to remember, especially for school administrators. Those of you here who are school administrators, this is important. Don't overlook that. It also comes through rumors, jokes, funny little comments, you know, oh, that weirdo handsy-pansy guy, you know, those are red flags. You've got to pay attention to them. Don't imagine that just because they're jokes or rumors that they don't have meaning. You want to make sure that there isn't meaning there. Don't assume there isn't meaning there. But however these reports come that you hear, they have to be reported. And then eventually they will need to have a Title IX report done on them as well. And that's an important issue in terms of tracking and following. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And as I said before, false allegations are rare. They occur sometimes, but investigations usually ferret, in fact, almost always ferret them out. If they don't ferret them, then the few times that that doesn't happen, it's usually because there hasn't been a very good investigation done. So now I'm to prevention. Let me just take a second before I turn to the prevention and ask, are there questions? Is there anything you'd like to say? I know there's a chat box, but I can't see it. So
Yes, I'm watching it for you, and
oh,
I don't see any questions, but I have one in my own head that I would like to ask you if you have an answer to this. With respect to gender percentage split of perpetrators, do you have any information on that?
have a little bit of information on that. Uh, ab- about 70% of the perpetrators are males, and 30% are females. There tends to be different patterns on that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Remember, 70%, for instance, this is really mostly of teachers. So 70% of male teachers, and they're 25% of the teacher population. So I think the last ratio I looked on that was a male is 8 times more likely than a female to sexually abuse a student. But that doesn't mean female abuse doesn't happen. And I want to explain the differences in the patterns. So male patterns tend to be almost all of the abuse that occurs at the elementary level are male patterns. Mary Jo Letourneau is an exception, but almost all of those are males. Females tend to be where you see them in high school. Males tend to make it into a sexual encounter. They tend to say that they like the girl or the boy. They care about them, but they don't see this as a lifelong love relationship, even though they often promise that to the targeted student, particularly those in high school. Females often say things like, I found the love of my life. I found my soulmate. Um, I found, what I never had. Uh, both groups tend to be married uh, and often have students in the school district. Children, in the school district who are students in the school district. So the patterns are a little bit different. There are a few female patterns, a few female proportions that are just directly a sexual interaction with a male student. Those are usually high school students, late high school students, but often it has a strong emotional belief system of this is love. And sometimes you see in both cases in middle school and high school, the adults kind of acting like they are middle schoolers or high schoolers, playing out in ways that seem more like they're treating, not more like, they are treating their students as if they're peers, as if they're all the same. We come out. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not females get charged, uh, have lesser charges brought against them when they're arrested, and that they get off easier. There have been a few studies done on that, and there's no indication one way or the other in those studies about that there's a different treatment. What there is a different treatment about is how seriously people take it. So, for instance, an example is I was doing an interview once on NBC, I think, and then after the filming was done, one of the cameramen said this, and this is common, said, I would have given anything to have had a teacher like that. I don't see what the big deal is. The guy's getting off great. He's having sex with his teacher. It's every guy's fantasy. And I'll admit, I don't know much about guys' fantasies, but what I do know is that that interaction harms the student. And what happens is they're often confused. They don't know how to respond to it. They feel guilty. Sometimes they feel dirty. They feel bad about themselves. And they, just like females, have long-term mental, physical, and emotional effects. It's not a surprise that the Centers for Disease Control identifies child sexual abuse as a public health problem. It's a health problem. People who are sexually abused, as you all know, have more health issues and die younger than people who weren't sexually abused as children. And those numbers carry through to kids who are sexually abused in schools. So that's sort of what we know about males and females. So don't assume that if somebody says something about a female, it's probably not true. It could be true. With maybe 30% of the reports, certainly in high schools, being inappropriate actions by female. Any other questions before we talk a little bit about prevention?
Nothing in the chat. I think you're good to proceed.
Okay. So you really have to see it as a comprehensive approach to stopping this. And I'll talk about each of these specifically, but you've got to have policies that cover everything. You've got to have good hiring practices, training, supervising and monitoring. You have to be able to respond and report. You have to communicate well and do healing. It's a shared commitment. And I think what we miss sometimes is that it takes everybody to make this a safe place. It really does. It's not just any one person's responsibility. So I do a lot of work looking at school districts where sexual abuse has taken place and the adult abuser is in prison. So I look at what happened there, what went on, what did the school have in place, what didn't they have in place, and it's these case studies, about 250 of them now that I've done, that reinforce how important this comprehensive approach is. So a lot of times we don't have good policies in our schools. The Title IX requires that there be certain things in school policies. It's a federal law. It's been required for decades. And yet, as I look at school policies, I see that at least 60% of the schools don't have sufficient policies as required by federal law. Now, it's true that a policy alone won't stop sexual abuse of kids in schools, but it's nevertheless a foundational issue. It's foundational because the policies are our rules. And sometimes people will say to me, well, why do we need policies? I mean, can you prove to me that having good policies will stop sexual abuse of kids in schools? And I say, no, I can't prove that that alone will. But would you make the same argument about stop signs? Can you prove to me that having a law against stopping at a stop sign prevents all accidents? Are you arguing that we should get rid of laws about stop signs or laws about any of the other things we do? No, you're not. And so the issue is we need these policies. And the policies also help people understand the extent of what's expected of them and what the school district will do if you don't follow the policies. So I've actually, as a handout, I have like a checklist of things that should be in everything. Sort of if you wanted to do an analysis of your district and just go down, or your school and just go down and check. But some of the things is that the major thing around policies for me is that you need to include more than just a mandated reporter policy and more than just a sexual harassment policy. And this is why. Generally, but legally, sexual harassment is unwanted sexual attention. And of course, when we're talking about adult to student, unwanted is irrelevant. Okay, minors can't consent. So there's no consent issue with minors because they can't consent. So while sexual abuse of students by adults in schools is covered under Title IX, the actual language of sexual harassment under Title IX isn't quite accurate. That's why there's separate discussion of adult to student. So you need something in addition to the typical sexual harassment policy that most school districts have. You need a specific policy prohibiting adult to student sexual contact. And that policy needs to make it clear that contact is illegal, it's prohibited, there will be consequences, and it needs to give a lot of examples of what it would look like. What are the behaviors that are acceptable? What are not? How do you think about this? What are the boundaries? What kind of support do we give? What do we do if there's retaliation? Um, and a lot of this is looking ahead. So for instance, talking about retaliation, Title IX says you can't retaliate if somebody makes a report. Nobody can retaliate. Well, what we know when there are reports of students who are sexually abused by adults in schools, there's enormous amount of retaliation. And a lot of it happens from other kids. And the school is responsible for stopping that retaliation. Kids bully, kids gang up on the student who reports. In most cases, the students who've been sexually abused by an adult working in the school end up leaving the school. They can't stay. The environment is just too toxic and hostile to them. They either drop out or their parents move or they get moved to another school. So the issue of retaliation is big, but it's also the case that adults retaliate. One example I looked at was in one school where the teacher who is now in prison was popular. The teachers had a jar in their classrooms to collect money for his defense. And so it would be there, and kids would come up and put money in the jar to gather money to defend the teacher against these allegations by the student. In another, the teachers wore armbands in support of him and wore them all through the school and all day and in the classes and in this case, there were several students where the students attended class. Very often the teachers will say to the students who've made the report, and even though it's supposed to be kept confidential, word gets out, say things like, you're just a little liar, you're just making this up, you're ruining a good person's career. So there's just a lot of retaliation that goes on that doesn't get taken care of. And part of the reason it doesn't get taken care of is because school administrators don't handle it well. Very often they don't make a statement that someone has been arrested. They don't bring the faculty together to talk about what is expected, what you should do, how to act, how to respond, what to do about kids in the classroom, how to intervene to stop any discussion that would be negative. And so partly it's because they think they're being fair to the person who's been arrested. The person hasn't been tried yet, that's true. And so we don't know if she or he is guilty. But you have to do interventions in the beginning to stop the rumors, to give enough information to people to understand what has happened, and to give teachers and students the parameters about the behavior that you would expect to happen. And that doesn't happen very often in schools, and therefore that you see then a lot of retaliation and a lot of additional harm to the student victim. So the kind of boundaries that policies need to define are the physical affection boundaries, touching, kissing, back rubbing, rubbing sore muscles in the classroom, rubbing thighs. A lot of these things go on right in the classroom in front of other students. The kinds of verbal interactions that happen, the names that kids are called, honey, sweetie, special nicknames for the student that's being targeted by the adult. What kinds of things can you say? What kind of things can you talk about? Can you focusing on, you can't talk about your sexual life with your students. You can't talk about their sexual life with them. These are issues that are not on the table. Um, Kind of outside contact. No, you can't take your student out to dinner. No, you can't take them in a car unless you have permission by the principal for a specific issue, for a specific task. And in most cases, that permission wouldn't be given. No, you can't meet them someplace and go cross-country skiing together. Lots of policies need to include lots of information about electronic communication, uh, that you can't use private means to contact students. So your private email, your private text, your private phone number, those are all ways that predators have hidden relationships with students and set up meetings, uh, groom students, and nobody is able to really keep a handle, keep track of it because these are all private. Uh, you can't go on to students' Facebook accounts and be their friend. You can't have a private Facebook account that you let students on. What can you do? You can have a school email and email students. There can be a school text program, which many schools have, that you can use for texting students so that, when you're out at something, you can text everybody and say, you all need to be back here in 5 minutes. The kind of things that are useful and important. You can have a school Facebook account that you can all be on. And the difference there is that these are open to everyone. It's not private, and you're not having private conversations and private interactions. Again, you don't give students gifts. If you're going to give something like food or treats, it goes to everybody. It's a class thing, classroom thing. It's not just one person. One way students are targeted is people bring food in for lunch, and students come to their classroom for lunch. And sometimes it's 2 students, sometimes it's 3 students. But the idea is that's a time that you can use to groom the student and to get the student in there because they want some lunch, they're hungry, or they want a treat. And even if there's other students there, grooming can occur. And again, it's selective and it's not monitored. Traveling with students, transportation issues, no students in cars, no going alone with students. And again, a lot of after-school programs and guidelines. A lot of abuse occurs in after-school programs where there's less supervision, whether it's after-school homework programs, after-school daycare programs, after-school sports, after-school drama, after-school music. That's where you'll see a lot more of the actual physical abuse occurring because that's where there's more opportunity to be alone or in some kind of isolated area. So those need to be in those kinds of that kind of information needs to be in policies and regulations to make it clear, and in training, which I'll come to, but it's not clear to everyone just what's allowed and what's not allowed. And when it's not clear, people cross boundaries, sometimes purposefully and sometimes not. So there are people who might abuse a child, but won't if the boundaries are clear, the consequences are clear, and they understand. But more important is that everybody understands, so another person can look to their colleague and say, you can't do that. That violates our policies. You can't do that. So part of the issues in terms of prevention is to actually have the possible predator internalize these and not act. But part of the issue of all of these prevention strategies is so that all of us can see what's happening and we can speak up and report and say and understand that no, this violates. And particularly students. Very often students will say, for instance, well, they were girlfriend and boyfriend. And And that must be okay because nobody stopped them. Everybody saw them together in the hallways. They were in the hallways. They had lunch together. Everybody saw that. So we just assumed it was okay for teachers to be girlfriend and boyfriend with students. So we didn't report anything because we didn't know it wasn't allowed. Students assume that if nothing is done and nothing is said, it's allowed. So we have to help them understand what is and isn't allowed. And very often we don't teach students these things. Some of the people who do the most intervention, it turns out, are students. When they understand the rules, they do the intervention for a friend. So they tell the principal, they say, I'm really worried about my friend. This is what's happening. So it's really important that we're clear about what these behaviors are and that students are clear about them, as well as parents and other faculty members. So hiring and screening, yeah.
Apologize for the interruption. We have a couple participants that have asked some great questions about this retaliation issue, recognizing the great harm that's done to students when retaliation is a part of their environment. And they're asking if you have any strategies with respect to addressing that. Might that be something, if it comes from other students, that would be handled as part of the discipline code? And also, what about community retaliation against the family of the student that disclosed, or against the school that acted on the disclosure?
Good questions. So let me I'll start with students. When it's students retaliation, it is a disciplinary violation. And under Title IX and under the policies you're supposed to have under Title IX, it makes it clear that retaliation is not acceptable. And it's not, and must be stopped, not just that it must be stopped. And so that then needs to work its way into the disciplinary policies with students. All right. For faculty, it's the same thing. If the faculty is doing any retaliation, if there's any kind of partisan movement and retaliation, the faculty has violated Title IX, as well as if you have a code of conduct, which I suggest is important to have, also violates code of conduct. And if you have these in the policies, violates policies, which means there are consequences. And so someone has to stop it right away. If you hear of one thing, you have to stop it. You have to tell students in mass, you can't do this. What you're doing violates the law. You can't retaliate. You can't do these things. You have to do the same with faculty. So you have to not only deal with the person who did it, but you have to make a statement generally about why this is not acceptable and why it must stop. With communities, it's harder. And there is community retaliation, often to the family, because this person was seen as a great coach and we had winning teams, and what are you doing to us? And so that does happen. And so sometimes the school school district, not necessarily the school district leader needs to speak up to the community and say, make a statement. These are matters of law. We support the reporting of allegations. The courts will determine what happened, what didn't happen. But until then, we need to treat everybody with respect. So a statement from the school. And in the end, sometimes the school district, there have been a few cases where the school district administrator ends up, sort of losing their job. It's not very common, but it does happen because people either are upset because it was allowed to happen, but more often because it became public and they didn't want this to happen. But it doesn't happen very often. And certainly that school district administrator has a lot of legal support for not losing the job, but nevertheless, that doesn't make it any less harmful. But that's less common. But it isn't unusual for a community, especially around sports. If the person happens to be a coach, to really rally around the person, and the school district has to make a statement about at this point, this is the law, this is how it's done. We need to stop this kind of behavior. At least they've taken a stand, and that helps the victims too. Even if it continues, the fact that it seems like the school district is on their side and has spoken out, not to say they know whether the person is guilty or not, but rather to say we encourage reports because we want to keep our schools safe. This is a process. We have to go through the process. We can't inhibit the process by having retaliation or threats or concerns. You need to all stop it. And that helps the people who've reported, because it affirms that what they did was expected and good thing to do. And then it's a next step. Does that make sense? Does that respond to the questions that were asked, you think?
Yes, thank you very much. That's spot on.
Great. So I was going to talk about hiring and screening. So what I find in hiring and screening, a lot of these are things that you, if as a mental health professional, for those of you who are here, or a counselor, these may not be within your purview, but these are the prevention strategies that are comprehensive that kind of help to create a safer school. So there are areas where we can target. For instance, the first one's an application form. In an application form, there should be questions about have there ever been complaints or allegations about inappropriate boundary crossing? Okay. Now the person may or may not tell the truth, but if they say yes, you get to follow up with questions when you interview them, if you get that far. If they say no, and it turns out there were, and they are behaving inappropriately, you have a way of removing that person from their employment because they lied on the application form. But you start at the application. The other thing that does in the application is it says to the applicant, this is a school district that takes seriously professional boundaries between adults who work in schools and the students who go to those schools. So if you're someone who wants to cross boundaries, abuse children, you might say, gee, maybe this isn't a school district I want to work at, because this is a place that's already alerted me that they're going to take this issue seriously. So school districts do criminal background checks, and we always tend to think, hey, if the criminal background check comes back clean, everything's good. Well, that's not really quite true. First of all, most of the abusers in schools have never been convicted of anything. So it won't come up, their behaviors won't come up on the criminal background check. Very often we do checks, but not national checks, not in every areas that they might have lived or worked. So sometimes you'll do a criminal background check in Colorado, but they work for 4 years in Iowa. And there are some reports. So it depends on the kind of criminal background check that's done, whether or not it might even catch something that has happened. Reference checks are the place where I see the most, an area the most in need of improvement. We tend to have little checklists that people fill out and send in. They don't include questions about were there ever allegations, concern reports about boundary crossing or inappropriate behavior with students. That's not a question that tends to be on those checklists. They should be. And we don't call up and ask questions. We don't do that for lots of reasons. We're busy, we're understaffed, that takes a lot of time, but it's time well spent in terms of making sure that the person you're hiring is safe. So things like looking at their resume or the application form, and then looking at the references they've listed and checking to see if they've listed their supervisors in positions, or are there positions that they've skipped, or are there people they've skipped. They may have good reason for that. They may have had a run-in with somebody that has nothing to do with kids, and they just don't think the person's going to give them a good recommendation. And that could be valid. you might still certainly hire somebody like that, but you need to be able to ask the question, why didn't you include someone from your last school? Why was, I see your supervisor isn't, your principal's not on the list, another math teacher's on the list. Can you tell me, why would that person be the person that we would contact? And so even when it says put down your supervisor, very often that's not the case. And if you call the person up, you can ask them questions like, you were their supervisor. How long were you the supervisor? Can you give me some information about that? And so it's important to match their employee history on the application with their reference list, and to actually contact those people in addition to having something on paper, and asking questions particularly about were there ever any issues of inappropriate or boundary crossing with students. What we find is that this often is the case. Very often, people at the other school will say things like, "If anyone would have asked me, I would have told them, but nobody asked me." Of course, you might say to that person, "Well, did you fill out a form? Did you write a little note on there?" So. And they might say, "I would have if that had been one of the questions." So that's the area that seems to be the most vulnerable in terms of things we miss. The other is some other areas are sex abuse registries, looking at their Facebook page, trying to just get a sense of who they are. And this is stuff we do sporadically, but this often gives information. Other social media, social security number checks. Been a number of cases where people have had two social security numbers and are actually on sex abuser lists, but use another social security number in applying for a new job. And then finally, behavior interviewing. In the interview, ask questions. Whether it's a custodian or a teacher, ask them questions. If a student ran up to you and hugged you, what would you do? If a student did this, if a student wanted a ride home, how would you think about this? So ask questions, and there's a lot of good behavioral scenarios out there that convert into some good interview questions about student interactions and how they would handle the student interactions. It gives you a sense of how people think about their boundaries and whether or not their boundaries are firm.
So,
So,
Dr. Biggshaft,
yeah.
a couple questions came up regarding the hiring and screening process.
Yeah.
Actually, one was just a great suggestion, and that was that oftentimes if an applicant is asked if they've undergone any good child sexual abuse prevention training, that can be an indicator that the district really, or the school, cares a great deal about that issue, and that can have the impact of making that employee or applicant less likely to want to work for the district.
Great.
Yeah. And the question, which I think that you got to, is sometimes schools will allow abusers to resign in lieu of firing if they're under investigation. Now, we have a law in Colorado that, with respect to public schools, that prevents, that actually gives a mandate to the district to report that to the Department of Education if someone resigns under investigation. But in a private school environment, it's less likely that the school would have access to that information. I think that the questions you gave with respect to how to flesh that out in the application process would cover that. But if you want to hit any other strategies that you could suggest there.
Yeah, actually, that's really a good piece. So it's called passing the trash, which is when school districts let someone resign, and then they go to another school district, and they can just say, "Oh, I just thought it would be good to broaden my horizons and try another place." And it's true, there's a movement across the country to get states to pass laws that prohibit districts from allowing people who have allegations against them to resign. that you have to make a decision. That and you can you cannot accept their resignation and instead say that that you're firing them, that they're no longer employed. And that's an important thing to be able to do, because it actually has been one of the major issues in terms of people moving from district to district to district, and and um, and state to state. So it isn't just stayed in the same state. So, recently worked with some people where they started in, I think they started in Montana, then they went to New Mexico, then they went to Arizona. And in every state, sexually abused many children. And the person in the first state, they were reported to, I think, the Montana Department of Education, who was going to revoke their license, but they got to the next state in time to get a license, and then uh, use that license. And then they went to a next state and got another license, and even though there were allegations against them in the second state. So in no place had they ever actually been fired. They had had allegations against them, then they had moved, and so it just kept happening, just kept going on and on and on. Another example that I worked on, which is horribly tragic, was a band director who'd sexually abused students, and so the district let him move, and he moved from Michigan to Florida. And in Florida, he did the same thing with students, and one of the students committed suicide. And one of the students that he had uh, abused in Michigan grew up to be a district attorney, and she tracked him down, and she got him convicted in Michigan and in Florida, and with help in Florida and things. There isn't always that happen, but in the meantime, a student committed suicide, and there were many students whose lives were really terribly harmed because they just moved states or they moved to other places. I did a study one year, once in New York State. I looked at about 150 school superintendents who said they had had reports of physical, sexual, serious misconduct by an adult in their school district toward a minor, reported to them, and they all thought it was true. And in most of the cases, they didn't even move, they didn't do anything, except maybe if it was a high school student that had been targeted before, they moved the predator to an elementary school or to a middle school. In many cases, they allowed them to resign and didn't say anything, and essentially said, if you resign, we'll give you a good recommendation. There was only one school superintendent of all those 150 who actually tracked down the people every place they moved to call up to say, you can't hire this person, you can't hire this person, But things are a little better than that, because that was a few years ago, but still, those are still patterns that are going on. So it's an important thing. Thanks for bringing that up. So naturally, since I'm an educator, I think the one of the most important parts of prevention is the education and the training that needs to be done. I think we have some good data that the more we know, the more we understand our responsibilities, the more likely we are to be able to stop it. And again, a lot of the education and training is going to us as bystanders for us to intervene and stop something we see and report it. That's one of the important things with the training. It isn't so much that it will necessarily change a fixated predator. It won't. But what it will do, it will allure that predator's colleagues to behaviors that if they see them, they need to report them. It may change the behaviors of people who just want to take advantage of situations, because once they know they'll get caught, the idea of losing their job or being arrested is enough to deter them. So it can help in that way. But again, like I said before, the education and training really needs to be specific to school sexual misconduct. Now, everybody should get overall training about what it is, what it looks like, how to respond, what are our policies, what are our expectations. And that's everybody, custodians, clerical, cafeteria, professional staff. I see a lot of cases of school bus driver sexual misconduct, being alone with the last student on the bus. That's not unusual. By the way, custodians are really excellent people to train because they see things. And very often in cases where other people haven't seen anything, the custodian has seen a ton. Custodians don't know, this is what I've learned, many custodians don't know they're supposed to report, even though they may have had some mandated training, reporter training. They don't really understand, and it's not the nature of being custodians, it's the nature of all of us. There's a disconnect between what we learn in mandated reporting training, which focuses on, okay, a kid might be being sexually abused outside of the school. These are the signs that a kid might be being abused in any way, actually, physical, mental, emotional. These are the signs, and if you see them in the kid, you need to report. So the way mandated reporter training generally is done, it's done on a model that the abuse is occurring in the home or outside the school, and we need to look at the kid to see if there are signs that we need to intervene and protect that child. Well, when it's a school employee doing it, we actually can look at the school employee behavior. We can't look at the parent behavior because we're not in the home. So we're using the child's behavior as a proxy of whether or not there might be some kind of abuse going on. But for school employee sexual misconduct or school employee abuse of any kind, we can actually look at the adult's behavior and report it. And so very often people don't make the connection because I don't think, because most mandated reporter training wasn't written and set up for us to help make that connection about school employees. They don't make the connection that we also have to report people in the school. Custodians, when they're interviewed after something has happened, I'll give you a couple examples. One person said to me, yeah, I went in there and every day he was alone with that girl. Every day, and I'd go in and they'd jump apart. And, you know, he had a desk, you know, with the front was solid, but underneath the desk he had a little mattress, and she was often on that mattress, and she'd hide underneath that mattress when I came in. But I was, you know, doing custodian work. I could see her. I saw she was under there. So just things like that. And the question was, well, why didn't you report it? And he said, well, I didn't know I was supposed to, but even if I knew I was supposed to, I'd be afraid I'd lose my job. You know, so again, worried that that position as a custodian would be vulnerable if they reported a powerful person like a teacher or someone else was doing things that they shouldn't be doing. So again, training helps people who see things and who hear things. Clerical people hear a lot of things. Cafeteria workers hear a lot of things. Helping them understand what they're hearing, what they're seeing, and why you might report that to a principal or someone else so that that could be taken into consideration for further investigation. And then there are specific training that's required by Title IX for administrators, for school boards, for Title IX coordinators, and then parent training and student training. Again, we don't give students a lot of training about what is acceptable behavior between adults and students. We should. That's important. Students need to understand what's acceptable. Because if we don't tell them it's unacceptable, they believe, according to studies and according to my own work with students, they believe that it must be acceptable or somebody would have said so. So training is really important. And training that allows people the time to have scenarios and to have discussions is very helpful. A lot of school districts will say to me, yeah, we do training on this. And I say, so tell me about it. Tell me a little bit about it. And what they say is, well, at the beginning of the year, we do training every year. At the beginning of the year, we tell them, we either give them the employee manual and tell them to read it, and they sign they've read it, so we've trained them. Or we tell them the policies are on the website and they sign that they'll read the policies. Well, I don't know about you, but the chances of me going on the website and reading all the policies are slim. But even if I did read all the policies, that wouldn't necessarily make me trained. Being told to read a manual isn't training, isn't education. It's just not. It's just information. And I'll admit to you, I have to take a lot of trainings at the university. It's required as a faculty member. And I grumble about it. I don't have time for this. I'm busy. I do blah, blah, blah. But guess what? I learned something in these trainings. I actually, every time, and I think there's nothing they can teach me. I shouldn't admit that I have these secret feelings of that. But, what I know about this topic, but you know what? That's not true. I learned something, or I'm reminded of something that I once knew that I've forgotten. Um, and so even though I grumble, as do almost all my colleagues grumble, we learn something because we have to do it and we have to have that box marked off. And ours is online training, but it could be any kind of training. And it's really important that it gets done. So avoid one-shot training. There's lots of different ways to do that. You can bring things up, train every year, train by announcement. If you see behaviors that aren't working, back in the days when people had had speakers in the classrooms and there were announcements between classes and stuff, you could say things like, just a reminder, we don't take students in our cars, or just a reminder. You can do a lot of just a reminder kind of things to people, for kids and adults, to just bring up things you see that have been reported to you, that you kind of looked into, that are starting to be boundary crossings. You don't have to mention any person's name. You can just remind people that that's not acceptable. That's really good. In addition to dealing with the individual, giving a general announcement about the issue is really helpful. And I've already said a little bit about that the mandated reporter training is usually not sufficient. There's a few mandated reporter trainings that have sort of gotten an overhaul and include lots of things, but most of them don't. And when something happens, if you see something and you're trained, what I just said, and you're dealing with it, also have a general announcement reminding other people not to do that. Just sort of like, remember, we don't park in the teacher slots. We don't. It's the same kind of thing. Think of it as a general announcement about how we get to do things and what's expected of us. Any questions about training or anything? We're good?
Yes, a couple of questions have come up. One, in fact,
Margaret, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. I think I feel your pain, Dr. Shakeshaft. So yes, so I just chatted in a resource that we have compiled here at the center on prevention programming, training programs for children. So that was one of the questions that came up. Another question is, with regard to training, can districts mandate background investigations and training for school bus drivers if they work for a private company? And I don't know if you're going to be able to answer that because it may be a state law issue. But any information you can provide in that regard would be helpful.
Well, it is a legal issue, so I don't know the answer to that. But what I do know is that in almost all of the places that require bus driver training, they are sort of they are employed by another organization. I bet another company, and then it's like and then the school district hires that other company to provide the bus drivers. But the school districts require that the company must do that, and that they monitor, and the school district monitors to make sure it's done. So, so there may be a legal issue in Colorado or something about that. I don't know, but I know that it's done nationwide and required nationwide. If you're going to be a company that gets hired, you have to meet these you have to meet these conditions that we require, and we need to be able to monitor that you're doing that.
That makes sense, that there would be an MOU with regard to that. And I think that's it with respect to education and training.
So let me move to, and thanks for putting the link up about student training. That's really important. Again, what we need to know is students need to understand what kinds of behaviors they should expect from adults, and that if adults are doing things that are not on the list of acceptable behaviors, that they need to tell somebody. So supervising and monitoring. You know, a lot of I'm sympathetic. First of all, I teach school administrators, so naturally I'm sympathetic because they're the people I teach. And of course, I think all of the people I teach are wonderful. So therefore, I assume everybody's wonderful. Now, all the people I teach may not be wonderful. I just may have a misinterpretation of them. But nevertheless, I think, you know, I sort of say my group is teachers and school staff and administrators. I understand how hard it is. The job is hard, and it's hard to keep track of everything, and it's hard to do everything every day. And that's why it's so important that we all understand that we're part of this prevention network, because an assistant principal can't check every room, can't know everything. A counselor can't see everything that may be happening or pick up on everything. It's just not doable, given how in most school districts in this country, most school districts in our country are understaffed. And so we've got to do it together. We've got to keep our eyes open together. But, you know, walk into classrooms during lunch, before school, after school. That's when you would see whether inappropriate behavior is going on. Look, as you're walking down the hall, look in. You don't have to be the assistant principal or the principal. Are there people in there, and why, and what's going on, and is this appropriate of what's happening? The before and after school and lunchtime and times when teachers have prep periods, those are the times when a lot of the grooming and a lot of the behavior goes on, either one-on-one alone or with a group of one or two. Listen to rumors and gossip from kids. You know, hear it. If they say something seems odd, you can ask, what do you mean by that? Check it out. If you're hearing certain things and, you know, he's weird, he acts so weird, he's all weird, touchy weirdo, investigate, find out what's happening. Look for warning signs, windows covered up, students alone in a room with the teacher, lights off, doors locked. You know, we have a lot of conflicting things in terms of what we're doing to prevent school shootings, and locked doors and windows covered up. You know, so we have some, in some schools districts, we have some competing sets of regulations. One that helps keep kids safe from sexual misconduct, and an opposite kind of requirement that might help keep them safe from school shooters. So there's some issues there that we have to try to figure out how to handle those. You know, encourage positive bystander behavior. The notion that we're all bystanders, what we see, we need to speak up about. We need to let someone know that we have a concern. Very often in cases, I'll talk to a teacher and I'll say, well, you know, you had a classroom across the hall from this person. Did you ever see anything? And they'll say, yes, yes, every day, and describe things. And I'll say, well, you know, why didn't you report? And sometimes, and actually what I next say was, well, would you do that? Would you act like that? Would you behave like that? Would you do these things? And the answer is almost always absolutely not. Never. That's so unprofessional. I would never do that. So that's a good clue. If it's something you would never do, that's a beginning. Okay. But then also just trying to find out why people don't report, what the issues are. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but we have to overcome our issues about reporting. Reporting doesn't mean that we necessarily know anything's happening. It means there are boundaries being crossed that aren't supposed to be. Somebody besides me, because that's not my job, needs to look into it. There are people who that's their job. Check telephones and texting. Very often when a student makes a complaint or somebody's made a complaint about a teacher, if somebody just asks to see the student's phone and the student gives the phone, you'll find text in there that will just shock you from the teacher or from the school personnel. You'll find, so if you're the assistant principal doing an investigation, ask for telephones and you know, follow the laws of the state, but ask for those. Teachers aren't supposed to be using their phones. No school employee is supposed to be using their phone to communicate with the student. And those things should be in your policies, which allow you to check for them. Watch to prevent intimidation. We talked about that. You know, make sure students aren't being intimidated to not speak up, to not say anything. And if somebody reports something and you bring the person in and you talk to them and they say, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. Yeah, you know, or I didn't do that, or they're making it up or whatever. You know what? Don't let it go. Just keep check on that person just to make sure. You just want to make sure that nothing's going on. If you see something and I'm going to talk a bit about investigations, and you do an investigation, you can bet the student's going to say, oh no, that didn't happen. And the adult's going to say, oh no, that didn't happen. That's just a given. That's generally, especially in high school, exactly what will happen. Which is why when we get to investigations, I'm going to tell you not to investigate. You report, and then if you think there's anything, you report it to the people who should do the investigation. So report to police or child services. What often happens is we get a report, somebody says, I've seen them alone a lot in the room by themselves, and we say, okay, I'm going to do an investigation. I'm the principal. I'll do an investigation. I'll talk to the teacher. I'll talk to the student. And again, usually what happens if it's high school, the student says, oh no, nothing's going on. The teacher says, oh no, nothing's going on. And that's the end of it. What you've done is you've alerted the adult that there's a concern, and so they may delete text, delete incriminating information. The same with the student. They may also, on their way to talk to the principal, text the student and say, delete everything on your phone, and if anybody asks you, you need to say XYZ. So if there is a report about inappropriate boundary crossing behavior, you need to really think about just turning it over to the police or to child services for people who have the ability to do investigations. Because as someone who teaches in a school administration program, we don't teach people how to do good investigations. That's not mostly their job. Sure, we teach people how to do student disciplinary kinds of things. We don't teach people how to investigate possible child sexual abuse, but there are people who are trained to do that, and you really need to turn it over to them. And under Title IX guidance, Title IX says, turn it over to the police, turn it over to the people who can do the investigations. In some school districts, there are people there who actually are specifically trained around these issues, and those people may be the people who do an investigation. You should not assume that your school resource officer knows how to investigate child sexual abuse. They don't. They haven't been trained in it. They don't know how to do it. They tend to botch it up. And a percentage of those school resource officers are sexually abusing students. So you can't make that assumption in terms of relying on that person unless you know that that person actually has experience and training in the investigation of complaints. No matter what, you will need as a school district or as a school to complete. If you're a school that gets no federal funds, ignore this. You will have to complete a Title IX investigation and a report. That's required under federal law if you receive federal funds. What that means is you can take the results of the police investigation or the child services investigation, and you can use those. You don't have to reinvestigate. You can use those, but then you have to make a determination. You have to determine what am I going to do next? If the person's been arrested, then your report says the person was arrested. We terminated that person from employment, and these are the things we did to follow up to make sure the student was safe and healing and things were working. If the person wasn't arrested and it's not clear exactly, very often the person won't be prosecuted. In any number of cases, district attorneys may say, we're not going to prosecute that case. There may be child sexual abuse, and in fact, there probably was some abuse or boundary crossing, but I don't think we'll win that case, and we're not going to take it on. So just because the case isn't prosecuted doesn't mean there's not something that has to be done by the school district. There is. The school district has to make a determination about, for instance, maybe that teacher isn't being prosecuted, but that teacher's behavior, which we've all seen is admitted to, violates our policies. Therefore, this is what we're going to do. So you have to make a determination no matter what, and have a report written and have a conclusion written. Now, most of you won't be the ones who do that report, but the school administrators among you may be some of those people who have to do that. So don't forget that that's important. Anything about responding and reporting before we go on?
Nothing has come into the chat.
Okay. So in the aftermath, when something's happened, if you've had something happen in your school or your school district, after whatever has happened, whatever goes on, you need to go back and look. You need to do, sort of what were our policies accurate? How did this happen? How could this happen? What went wrong? And it's not so much pointing the finger and blaming. It's trying to say, what do we need to do to make sure that our school and our district is safe? Was the supervision adequate? What could we have done differently? What did people see and hear? Were reporting procedures followed? If they weren't followed, why weren't they followed? Understanding so that it doesn't happen again. And too many times I see this happen again and again in school districts or in schools where there's no new actions taken after someone's just been arrested for sexually abusing a kid. That says to you, we need to check internally for the future to make sure this doesn't happen again. So why don't adults report? Sometimes they don't understand what they're seeing. They don't understand the red flags. They don't understand the boundary crossings, that's something that needs to be reported. So partly it's just, and training helps with that. Absolutely. Sometimes they don't want to hurt a colleague's career. Well, you know what? I did a study of people who had allegations brought against them, and they were unfounded. Most of them became school principals. Doesn't hurt their career, or maybe becoming a school principal hurts your career. I don't know. But anyway, but my point is that that's an overblown assumption about what would happen if you made a report that, well, this teacher is always alone with students, and if there's something going on, you've helped, and if there's nothing going on, that's it. There's nothing going on. Fear that disclosing will hurt the school, make our school seem like it's not a safe place. Some people don't understand how reports are investigated, so they don't understand that they have to first tell somebody so there can be an investigation. And many people don't understand the threshold for reasonable suspicion, reason to believe, or rumors. So a lot of people think, well, I couldn't report because I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure. I mean, I suspect something's happening, but I don't know for sure. And so we need to keep reminding them that you don't have to know for sure. It's not your job. Your job is if somebody's crossing boundaries, if there's a suspicion that a child might possibly be harmed, you report, someone else will look into it. That's their job, to find out whether or not this is accurate and then to do something. So that's why adults don't report. Kids don't report a lot of times because they're manipulated by abusers. You know, I love you, you're my favorite person, whatever. Down to the bottom list, if you report me, I'll get in trouble and you'll ruin my life forever. Do you really want to be responsible for ruining my life? Because I love you. You know, so it's that double manipulation. Very often children don't know that what's happening to them is abuse. They just don't understand. They don't like it. It feels bad, or sometimes it doesn't feel bad. It doesn't matter if it feels bad or doesn't feel bad. It's child sexual misconduct. And so sometimes kids just don't understand. A lot of times they're embarrassed. They feel guilty. They think they're going to be blamed. They don't believe anybody's going to protect them. And so they're just going to be, and I can't tell you how many situations kids have reported things, they have been punished. So there's reason for kids to believe they might get in trouble because they've seen it happen before. They fear reprisals. They fear that other kids will harm them, that other teachers will harm them, that the abuser will harm them, and they don't know how to report. And a lot of times they say, I did report. I told the principal that he was weird and doing weirdy things, you know, and so that for them is a report. And for us, it should also be a report. But very often the school district will say, well, that isn't a real report. They just said he was doing weird things. And again, a lot of times the relationship with the student and the abuser is a very complicated relationship. Very often the student has positive and good feelings toward the abuser at the same time as having revulsion and negative feelings. And we can't underestimate how much that keeps a student from being able to speak up. So healing, we don't do a lot about healing. We got to heal. A victim needs healing. They need things. They need special help. They need counseling. They need support. The school needs healing. If one of your colleagues who you liked a lot, you suddenly find out that colleague is sexually abusing kids, that's a wound. It's a wound to you as a person. Why didn't I see that? Why didn't I know that? How did I miss that? What's wrong with me? And the community needs healing. So we have to pay attention to healing. That's really important. And we don't do very much of that. We don't bring people together and say we need to be healed. We don't bring people together to let out their feelings. You know, a lot of people, when there's a teacher who's done a lot of good, but also done a lot of bad, the people for whom that teacher has done a lot of good are angry, are hurt, don't know how to figure it all out. But you've got to understand that for some people, that teacher was a good teacher and a child abuser. And it's complicated. And so you've got to have that healing and that understanding. And we don't. We leave people just on their own. And we leave kids on their own. You know, how could Miss So-and-so have done that? She was so nice to me. How could Mr. So-and-so have done that? He was so good to me. And so that's a very important part of what has to be done, and what a lot of the people in this audience are able to do. You're the healers that can bring the kind of healing that needs to happen when there is an incident in your school or in your district. And that's basically what I want to say, and to leave time for comments and whatever, and to say that if there's any way I can help anyone, I'm happy to. I'm happy to share materials, give you anything I have that would help you in any way I can, for free. So just know that my goal is keeping kids safe like your goal is keeping kids safe. So thank you for this opportunity. And I'm
Thank
going to
you
stop.
so much, Dr. Shakespeare. There are a couple things that we would love for you to clarify with respect to that healing concept. And the first is, how can we promote healing opportunities without opening the door to retaliation? And secondly, when charges aren't filed, it can become more complex. And I know schools are in a situation where they don't want to find themselves defaming or slandering. So how do we message that safely?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and don't count on me for the best answer for that. Okay. Uh, one of the reasons you can go into the university device is get you out of having to deal with all the very hard things that people who are really in schools doing that hard work have to face. But what I've found in my studies is that sometimes the messaging is just if charges aren't made and people don't know about it, then your healing tends to be with the people who do know about it. If people know about it, but nothing else is done, you provide opportunities for people to come and talk and people to come and say their feelings without necessarily having to comment on them, or you teach them in general about the things we worry about. And what we do know is that there is abuse that goes on in schools, and that's what we're trying to make sure we stop. And let us talk a little bit about that and what we can do to stop that. So sometimes you take it to that other level that takes it out of the place where you can't really say anything about the person. What you can talk about are the behaviors that are acceptable and not acceptable in the school. And I bet there are people in this group that have additional and better ideas about that.
One other thing that came up earlier in the chat was with respect to perpetrators. You indicated that most were married. Do you know if the research provides percentage splits for us about heterosexual versus homosexual offenders?
Yeah, well, a lot of the homosexual offenders are married. So what we call homosexual offenders. And so let me go back. So that we used to have this idea that one of the red flags would be a single man who lived at home with his parents. That was a red flag as a possible predator. And that there is a little descriptor that some of those people fall into that. But also a lot of the predators who are males who target male students are married and have children, married to females and have children. And so we can't rely on that one demographic description. And I think one of the things that certainly across the board in terms of child sexual abuse and is true in schools is that it's not so easy to pin down a profile. There is no specific one profile that says if this person fits this profile, we know that this person is likely to be a sexual abuse. We just don't have that profile. And that's what makes it so hard. So what we do is we try to identify based upon their behaviors and how they interact. And so what you don't see a lot of is staff members who are openly gay, LGBTQ plus. What you don't see a lot of that is people who are openly being accused being sexual abusers. That's what you don't see.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I apologize. I asked the question as if homosexual folks can't be married, and just want to clarify that. So I appreciate that. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If you have any, please put them in. We are right at 9:45. I just want to thank you again, Dr. Shakeshaft, for your time and your expertise. And it's an honor to meet you, and after having read so much of your research. So Thank you. And I'm going to let our audience know that we are going to be back here at 10 o'clock to listen to Dr. Amber Morchek. So thanks again, Dr. Shashaft. Appreciate you.
Thank you all. Thanks a lot.